A life shattered and rebuilt. The fire station was quiet, save for the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional shuffle of boots. It was a rare calm night, the kind that allowed John Carter a few moments of peace. The weight of his 15 years as a firefighter had settled into his bones, a mixture of pride and exhaustion. He had seen too much, too many lives lost, too many families torn apart by the unpredictability of fire. But it was the moments of survival, the ones where lives were saved, that kept him going. John had always been drawn to the idea of service. It was what had driven him to become a firefighter in the first place. But tonight, as the clock ticked past midnight, he felt a strange sense of foreboding creep over him. It was the kind of feeling he'd learned to trust over the years, the kind that whispered danger before the siren even screamed. Suddenly, the silence shattered. The alarm blared, filling the room with a sound so familiar it made John's heart race. Without hesitation, he moved, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. His hands were steady, though his heart thudded louder with each passing second. This was his job, and he was good at it. He had to be. "Engine 6, come in." The voice crackled over the radio. John grabbed his gear, pulling it on with practiced speed. The heavy weight of his fire suit felt comforting, a second skin that had saved him countless times before. The dispatcher's voice came again, clearer now. "Mark Thompson's residence, Oak Street. House fully involved. Report of multiple people trapped inside." John's stomach lurched. Mark Thompson. He knew that name all too well. Mark wasn't just a neighbor. He was someone John had known since he was a child. Someone who had become part of his extended family in a way that few ever did. But it wasn't just Mark who made the situation personal. It was the children. 3 little boys who had been in Mark's care for as long as John could remember. The car sped toward Oak Street, the sirens screaming through the night air. John's knuckles turned white around the steering wheel. He knew the Thompson house well. He'd been there countless times, dropping by to say hello, watching the boys grow up from their early childhood into the young men they were now. They had lived through hardship after hardship, but Mark had always been there for them. He was the kind of man who didn't back down from a challenge. But tonight, something had gone terribly wrong. The house was burning to the ground, and John's heart felt heavy in his chest. As they approached Oak Street, John's eyes locked on the scene ahead. Orange flames leaked into the sky, casting a menacing glow across the entire block. Thick black smoke billowed from the windows, obscuring the once cozy home that had become a place of refuge for those 3 boys. Thompson residence, full engagement. John's voice cracked as he spoke into the radio, sending the words out into the night air. It was automatic, almost robotic. He had to stay focused. John quickly disembarked from the fire truck, the heat from the blaze striking him like a physical blow. He grabbed his hose, making sure his mask was secure. His breath was already short from the adrenaline coursing through his body. As he looked around, the neighborhood was eerily quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the murmurs of the gathered neighbors. This wasn't just a fire. This was a disaster. The Thompson family home was engulfed in flames, but John's thoughts were already moving ahead. He had to act fast, and he had to act decisively. His mind raced through the options, calculating every step he needed to take to save the lives inside. He had seen it all before: the burning structure, the acrid smoke, the feeling of helplessness that settled in the air. But this time was different. This time, it was personal. His steps were heavy as he approached the front door, the heat from the flames making his mask fog with every breath. He could hear muffled voices inside, and his heart skipped. He knew those voices. They were the boys: Derek, Malik, and Tyrone. The 3 boys who had been abandoned by their biological parents at a young age. The 3 boys who had found a father in Mark Thompson. The same 3 boys who had become John's family over the years, even though they were never formally related. John had watched them grow, seen them struggle through the trials of childhood, always with Mark by their side. He even tried to help Mark, offering advice, support, or just an understanding ear when things got tough. He'd seen the boys go through hell and back, and he'd always admired the way Mark had handled it, raising them on his own, giving them the love and stability they needed, even when he had no idea how to do it. But now Mark's life was in danger, and the boys, where were they? John's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden crash from within the house. A scream. A voice. Help. Somebody, help. It was Derek's voice. Without a second thought, John charged into the house, ignoring the searing heat and the suffocating smoke. He couldn't wait any longer. The boys were inside, and Mark was his friend, his brother in arms. The man who had given everything for his boys. The man who had become a father when there was no one else. John wasn't about to let him lose everything now. The flames roared as John moved further into the house, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't see much. The smoke was thick, and the fire was relentless. But he could hear the boys' voices more clearly now, louder, desperate. He moved toward the sound, his heart pounding in his ears. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice barely rising above the roar of the flames. Derek, Malik, and Tyrone were trapped in the back bedroom. The heat was unbearable, but John pressed on, his body moving on pure instinct. There was no time to think, no time to second-guess himself. He reached the door to the bedroom, and with a grunt, he pushed it open, revealing the terrified faces of the boys. They looked up, their eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there, something that John had seen in them before. A trust. They trusted him. "Come on, we're getting out of here," he shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. John grabbed the boys, one by one, and led them toward the door. But just as they reached the hallway, the house seemed to groan, and the floor beneath them gave way. With a loud crack, the ceiling collapsed in front of them, blocking their only escape route. John barely had time to react. He threw himself over the boys, shielding them from the falling debris, his body taking the brunt of the impact. Pain exploded through his chest, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. "Get to the window," he barked, his voice strained. Now, the boys didn't hesitate. They scrambled toward the window, and John helped them climb out one by one, his heart in his throat the entire time. Finally, they were all outside, the cool night air a welcome relief from the searing heat inside. But Mark, John's heart sank as he realized the man who had been their father, their protector, was still inside. There was no way he could leave without Mark. No way he could leave his friend behind. The flames were closing in, the smoke thickening, but John wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when he still had a chance to save Mark. "I'll be back," he shouted to the boys, his voice hoarse with emotion. Without another word, he plunged back into the inferno. A debt of honor. The air inside the Thompson home was thick with smoke, and the walls seemed to close in on John as he navigated through the burning house. His vision was blurred, his breath labored beneath the weight of his oxygen mask. Each step was a battle as the heat pressed down on him like an unseen force. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the undeniable drive to rescue Mark. The house had been a sanctuary for the three boys ever since they could remember. A place where laughter had once echoed, where stories had been told late into the night. Now it was being consumed by a monstrous fire, threatening to swallow it whole, taking with it the life Mark had built. But John wouldn't allow that. Mark had given his all to raise those boys after they had lost everything, after being left by their parents without a second thought. Mark Thompson had taken them in and loved them like his own flesh and blood, and in turn, they had become his world. John had always admired Mark's resilience. A man who had grown up in the rough parts of town, had faced the kind of trials most people couldn't imagine, and yet had never wavered in his commitment to his family. Mark had fought for everything he had, his home, his career, his boys, and had made them believe that family wasn't about blood, but about love. Mark was the father every child deserved, And now John was determined to return that love. "Mark!" John shouted, his voice breaking through the roar of the fire. He was almost at the kitchen, the last known location where Mark had been before the fire broke out. There was no answer, just the deafening crackling of flames and the sound of timbers splintering under the heat. He moved quickly, his legs heavy with exhaustion, his thoughts focused solely on finding Mark. But the closer he got to the back of the house, the more the air seemed to burn his lungs. The smoke had grown so dense that even his trained eyes could barely make out the floor ahead of him. The flames had taken control of the hallway leading to the kitchen. Every instinct in his body told him to turn back, to save himself and the boys outside. But John knew he couldn't. Not without Mark. The fire had reached the stairs, sending crackling embers falling from the upper floor, and the structure seemed to groan with every passing second. It was clear that time was running out. Mark had to be somewhere nearby. John's fingers tightened around the hose, his heart sensing with the thundering beat of his pulse. He couldn't stop now, not when there was a chance. His foot struck something soft in the darkened hallway, and he froze. His heart skipped a beat. "Mark!" He called again, his voice more desperate now. A low groan answered him, a sound that sent a wave of relief crashing over him, followed by a surge of panic. Mark was alive. But where? John stumbled forward, his hands outstretched, brushing against the wall for guidance. The smoke was so thick now that it seemed to claw at his lungs with every breath. His head swam, but he couldn't stop. Not now. And then he saw him. Mark was lying on the ground near the staircase, his body half hidden by a collapsed beam. His face was pale, and the pain was evident even in the dim light. But his eyes, those familiar, determined eyes, locked onto John's. They had seen too much together to ever need words. "Mark!" John shouted, his voice shaking with relief. He rushed to his friend's side, pulling at the beam that pinned him down. But it was heavy. Too heavy. John's muscles screamed from the effort, and his mind raced. There was no time for this. The fire was spreading fast. "John!" Mark rasped, his voice weak but clear. "Get the boys. Get them out of here." "No, Mark." John's voice cracked with emotion. "You're coming with me. We're getting out of here. Now." Mark shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with something John couldn't quite place. Resignation, maybe. Or was it acceptance? "You have to save them, John," Mark said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm not going to make it, but you have to save them. Promise me." John's heart stopped, his hand freezing over the beam that trapped Mark. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Promise me." That was Mark's request. The man who had poured everything into raising those boys, who had fought for their future, who had turned his life around in order to give them the home they so desperately needed. And now, as the flames licked at the walls around them, Mark was asking John to make a promise that he wasn't sure he could keep. "Mark, please, don't do this," John choked, his voice thick with grief. But Mark's gaze held steady. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, every syllable carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. John knew this. He knew that Mark would never ask for help unless it was truly a matter of life and death. "I trust you, John," Mark said quietly. "I trust you with them." John's eyes burned, but there was no time for tears. Mark was right. He had to save the boys. They needed him. John nodded, his hands shaking as he worked to free Mark from the wreckage. But it was clear that Mark wouldn't make it out, not with the way the fire had taken hold of the house. "I won't leave you, Mark," John said, his voice firm. But Mark grabbed his arm weakly. "Go, John," he urged, his grip surprisingly strong despite the pain. "Go." The flames roared louder, the house creaking under the pressure. John could feel the heat intensifying, threatening to collapse the entire structure. He had to make a choice, and it broke his heart. "I promise," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. John had seen death before, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just a fire. This wasn't just a life lost. This was Mark, a man who had fought so hard for his boys, for their futures, and for his own redemption. John had no words, only the promise that he would carry Mark's love for his boys into the world. With a heavy heart, John turned and ran toward the back door, hoping, praying that he could make it out in time. The house was collapsing behind him, but he could hear Mark's voice in his mind. "Save them, John. Promise me you'll save them." As John rushed outside, the heat from the inferno pushing at his back, he found the three boys standing together, watching the fire consume their home. They hadn't moved, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. But there was something else in their expressions, something John couldn't quite place. It was a look of loss, a look of acceptance. They knew, even before John did. John took a deep breath, and without a word, he opened his arms. The boys, his boys, rushed toward him. And in that moment, as they gathered around him, he knew, no matter what came next, he had kept his promise. But as the fire blazed behind him, John couldn't help but wonder, could he really repay the debt that Mark had left him with? The debt of a father's love, a lifetime of sacrifice. The journey ahead would be long, but one thing was certain. He would never let Mark's legacy go unfulfilled. The promise he made would guide him forward, and the bond they had forged, through fire, through loss, through love, would never be broken. The promise of a new beginning. The sound of the fire raging in the distance seemed to echo in John's ears as he held the three boys close, each of them trembling in his arms. The smoke hung in the air like a thick blanket, and the flames licked at the night sky, casting an orange glow over everything. It felt as if time had stopped, if only for a brief moment, allowing John to breathe, to assess the situation. The boys were safe. They were outside, away from the fire, but that didn't change the fact that they had just lost everything. For a brief second, John felt the weight of their loss like an anchor in his chest. Mark Thompson, the man who had sacrificed everything for his boys, was gone. The house that had been their home for years was now nothing more than smoldering ruins. The foundation of their lives was reduced to ash and dust, and the only thing left standing was the memory of Mark's love for them. John wiped a tear from his cheek, but he didn't speak. There was no need for words right now. The fire was still crackling in the distance, and the sirens of the fire trucks and ambulances had faded into the background as they attended to the scene. The smoke still hung thick in the air, and the boys remained silent, their faces pale and stricken with shock. What do we do now?" Derek's voice broke the silence. His voice was soft, filled with a tremor that John hadn't heard in years. Derek, the oldest of the three, had always been the strong one, the one who tried to keep everything together. He was the one who had always taken care of his younger brothers, who had stepped up in ways that no child should have to. But now, as he looked up at John, his eyes were filled with confusion and fear. John didn't know how to answer. What could he say? They had just lost their father, their home, and the life they had known. But in that moment, John knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let them face this alone. He reached down, pulling Derek into a tight hug. "We take it one day at a time, son. We take it one step at a time." Derek nodded, his arms wrapping around John's waist, seeking comfort in the warmth of his protector. Malik and Tyrone, the two younger brothers, stood close by, watching the scene unfold. They hadn't said much yet, but their eyes told a story of grief, loss, and confusion. "We'll figure it out," John continued, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions that raged inside him. "But right now, we need to get out of here. We need to get you somewhere safe. Let's just go." The drive to the nearest emergency shelter was quiet. The boys in the back seat, staring out the windows, lost in their thoughts. John's mind was in turmoil, his heart heavy with the weight of the promise he had made to Mark. He had saved the boys, yes, but what now? Mark was gone, and there was a future ahead of them that John wasn't sure he was ready for. He had never imagined a day like this, never once thought about what would happen if something happened to Mark. It had always been so clear. Mark had his boys, and John had always been there to support them in any way he could. But now everything was different. The responsibility of raising these boys, of filling the void that Mark had left, was now on his shoulders, and the weight of it was heavy. As the car slowed to a stop in front of a shelter, John turned to look at the boys in the backseat. They looked so small now, so vulnerable. It was hard to reconcile the strength they had shown over the years with the brokenness they wore now. He could see it in their eyes. They were scared. They were lost. And they had no idea what the future held. John had always prided himself on being a man of action, but this was uncharted territory. He had never been a father. He had never had to raise children on his own. Sure, he had been there for the boys over the years, offering advice and support, but that was different from being their guardian, from being the one responsible for their well-being every single day. He wasn't sure he was equipped for this. But then again, what other choice did he have? The shelter was a modest one, a temporary place for families in crisis. But the moment they walked inside, John could see the boys relax, just slightly. The shelter staff was kind, offering blankets, food, and a place to sleep for the night. The boys took their food quietly, not speaking much. But at least they were no longer looking lost in the chaos of the fire. John sat down at a small table, his mind spinning. He had so many questions. How could they rebuild? Where would they go? How could he give them the future they deserved when everything they had worked so hard for was now gone? He had always been a firefighter, always been a first responder in times of crisis. But this was different. This wasn't a burning building. This wasn't something that could be put out with a hose or extinguished with quick thinking. This was a family that needed healing, and that wasn't something John knew how to provide. John. Derek's voice interrupted his thoughts. The boy stood in front of him, holding his plate of food. Are we going to be okay? John didn't know how to answer. He could see the uncertainty in Derek's eyes, the same uncertainty he felt deep in his chest. But instead of answering with words, he stood up and pulled Derek into his arms once more. "We'll be okay, son," he said softly. "I'll make sure of it." Derek hugged him back tightly, as if clinging to the last thread of hope he had left. It was a silent promise, one that John wasn't sure he could keep, but one he would do everything in his power to fulfill. The next few days were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings with social workers, and arrangements for temporary housing. John had to make countless calls, trying to figure out what steps needed to be taken to secure a future for the boys. But no matter how much he tried to focus on the logistics, his thoughts kept drifting back to Mark, the man who had given so much to raise these boys, the man who had trusted him with their future. Mark had believed in him, and now it was up to John to ensure that his trust wasn't misplaced. Despite the uncertainty, one thing was becoming clearer. The boys needed him. They needed him to step into a role that he had never prepared for, a role that seemed impossible to fill. But John knew he couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not when they had no one else. By the end of the week, John had made some difficult decisions. He had decided to move the boys into a small house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was a fresh start, a place they could call home, even if it was temporary. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments when they would all wonder if they had made the right choice. But it was the first step toward rebuilding, and that was all he could ask for. The boys had been hesitant at first, unsure of the move. They had been through so much, and the thought of starting over felt like an impossible task. But John assured them that they would get through it together. The first night in the new house was strange. The rooms were bare, the walls empty. There was no warmth, no personal touch. But as John tucked the boys into bed, he knew that it wouldn't always be like this. They would make this place their own. They would fill it with laughter, memories, and the love that Mark had always shown them. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Derek began to go back to school, Malik started playing basketball again, and Tyrone found solace in his art, sketching pictures of his family. They weren't the same boys they had been before the fire, but they were healing. And that was something. As the months passed, John learned more about fatherhood than he had ever expected. He learned that it wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, day after day, no matter how hard it got. It was about making sure the boys knew they weren't alone, that no matter what happened, they would always have someone in their corner. But there were still days when the weight of the responsibility felt too heavy, when the shadow of the fire loomed over them all. John knew that the promise he had made to Mark, promising to raise these boys, to love them as he had loved his own children, would be a lifelong commitment. It wasn't something that could be done in a few months. It would take years. And every day, he would have to remind himself that he was doing this for Mark, for the family that Mark had built, for the boys who had lost so much. But through it all, John knew one thing. This was his family now, and he would give everything he had to see them through. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he was ready to face it, no matter what, because the bond they shared was unbreakable, and the love they had for each other would guide them through whatever came next. A legacy of love. The house had begun to take shape, slowly but surely. The days were a blur of school meetings, appointments, and small steps toward a future that, despite everything, was still full of promise. The boys were adjusting, albeit in their own way. Derek, the eldest, had found a steady rhythm in his schoolwork, pushing himself hard to excel, perhaps in an attempt to honor the dreams Mark had always had for him. Malik, the second eldest, had returned to his love for basketball. Though his heart wasn't fully in it yet, he played to fill the silence, to do something that felt normal in a life that had been anything but. Tyrone, the youngest, had taken solace in his art, creating sketches and drawings that depicted his family before the fire, capturing memories of a life he couldn't quite hold on to. But even as they moved forward, there was an undeniable heaviness that lingered in the air, a shadow of grief that seemed to follow them, no matter how much they tried to move past it. For John, life had become a balancing act. There were moments of joy, of shared laughter over meals, of the quiet companionship that had developed between him and the boys. But then there were also the moments of pain. There were nights when he'd hear the boys talking in the kitchen, sharing memories of Mark, and John would have to step away, his heart too full to handle the weight of their loss. Mark's absence was like an open wound that never healed, but John had made a promise, and he intended to honor it. No matter how hard it got, he would be there for them. Every Saturday morning, John would take the boys to the local park. They would play basketball, toss around a football, or simply walk along the trail that ran through the woods nearby. It was a way to reconnect, to remind each other that they were still a family. Even though the house was small, even though their world had been turned upside down, they still had each other. And that was something that no fire could take away. But one Saturday, as the sun began to set and the warm breeze rustled through the trees, John found himself watching his boys in a new light. Derek had grown taller, his shoulders broader. Malik had filled out, his playful nature returning as he scored basket after basket. Tyrone, however, was still somewhat withdrawn, more content to sit on the grass and sketch in his notebook. John walked over and sat beside him, glancing at the pictures his son was drawing. "What are you working on, buddy?" John asked softly. Tyrone looked up at him, his brown eyes thoughtful. "I'm drawing us," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm drawing what I remember, what it used to look like." John studied the drawings. There was Mark, standing proudly with his arm around Derek's shoulders, Malik laughing with a basketball in his hand, and Tyrone himself sitting on the front step of their old home. The picture was unfinished, just like the story of their lives. There were gaps, places where the lines didn't quite meet, spaces where details were missing. "It's beautiful, Ty," John said, his voice cracking slightly. Tyrone nodded, not looking up. "I miss him, John. I miss Dad." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. He had tried so hard to shield the boys from the harshness of their grief, to be strong for them, but Tyrone's vulnerability was a reminder that no matter how much he tried, he could never replace the father they had lost. "I miss him too, Ty," John whispered, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "We all miss him." Tyrone nodded again, then turned his attention back to the sketch. There was something cathartic about watching Tyrone express his emotions in this way. Through art, through drawings that told stories words couldn't quite capture. John realized then that the journey ahead wouldn't be linear. It wouldn't be a simple path of healing, because grief didn't work that way. It came in waves, and sometimes those waves would pull them under, and other times they would rise above them. But as long as they had each other, they would survive. As the days turned into weeks, John found himself becoming more and more attuned to the boys' needs. Derek was becoming more withdrawn, focusing on his schoolwork with an intensity that John hadn't seen before. Malik was increasingly distant, going through the motions but not fully engaging with the world around him. And Tyrone, while still passionate about his art, seemed to carry a heavy sadness in his heart. John knew that there was only so much he could do on his own. As much as he loved the boys, as much as he wanted to be everything they needed him to be, he couldn't carry the weight of their grief alone. He needed help, and that's when he made the decision to reach out. It wasn't easy for John to ask for help. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on handling things on his own. But this was different. Raising 3 grieving boys wasn't something he could do alone. So he contacted a local therapist who specialized in grief counseling for children. At first, the boys were reluctant. They didn't want to talk about their feelings, didn't want to sit in a room with a stranger and spill their emotions. But John insisted, and after a few sessions, the walls began to come down. Derek was the first to open up, though it was more of a trickle than a flood. He talked about his fear of letting Mark down, about feeling like he had to be the man of the house now that Mark was gone. Malik followed soon after, admitting that he felt lost without his father's guidance, unsure of what path to follow. Tyrone, ever the quiet one, spoke about how much he missed drawing with Mark, how much he missed the way Mark had always taken the time to sit down with him and admire his art. The therapy sessions were difficult, but they were also cathartic. Slowly, the boys began to heal. They still had their moments of anger, of frustration, of sadness, but they were learning to channel those emotions into something productive. Derek started playing basketball with more passion than ever before. Malik joined a local community league to get involved with other kids, and Tyrone's drawings became more vivid, more detailed. But it wasn't just the therapy that helped them. It was the love and support that John had been giving them from the very beginning. He had made a home for them, a place where they could feel safe, where they could cry, laugh, and dream without fear of judgment. He had become the father they needed, even though he didn't always have the answers. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, John found himself watching the boys interact with each other. Derek was teasing Malik about his basketball skills, and Malik was playfully rolling his eyes. Tyrone was showing off his latest artwork, explaining the meaning behind each piece. It was a moment of normalcy, a moment that felt like a new chapter in their lives. John smiled to himself, realizing that despite the struggles, despite the hardships, they were finding their way. "John," Derek said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking." John raised an eyebrow, looking at his son. "What about?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I want to help you," Derek said, his tone serious. "I know you've been doing everything for us, but I want to do something for you. I know you're still grieving, too." John's heart swelled with pride. Derek had always been a thoughtful, caring young man, but hearing him speak like this, with such maturity, made John realize just how far they had come. "You're already doing more than enough, son," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I appreciate it. I really do." Derek smiled, his eyes lighting up. "I'm serious, John. I want to help around the house more. I want to make sure we're all okay. You're not alone in this." Tears welled in John's eyes as he looked at the young man in front of him. It wasn't the first time he had been moved by Derek's strength, but it was a reminder that he wasn't just raising these boys. They were raising him too. They were teaching him the power of love, of resilience, of family. And in that moment, John realized that the promise he had made to Mark, to take care of his boys, to give them the life they deserved, wasn't just a promise to Mark. It was a promise to himself too. A promise that he would never let them down, no matter what. Together, they were rebuilding, not just their home, but their future. And while they could never replace what had been lost, they could create something new, something beautiful from the ashes of the past. The journey was far from over, but with each passing day, they were one step closer to healing. Rebirth from ashes. The warmth of summer was beginning to settle in, bringing with it a sense of calm after the storm of the past several months. The days were stretching out, longer and warmer, and the house, though modest, had begun to feel like a home again. There was an energy in the air that hadn't been there before. Laughter filled the rooms. The sound of shoes dribbling basketballs echoed through the driveway, and the quiet hum of music drifted from the boys' rooms. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was progress. The fire had taken so much, but it hadn't destroyed everything. Slowly but surely, the pieces of their lives were being put back together, one by one. For John, it felt like a miracle in motion, like watching a garden bloom again after a long, harsh winter. The boys were growing into themselves. Derek, once distant and guarded, was beginning to open up more. He had started talking more openly about his future, his aspirations, and how much he wanted to give back to the community that had helped them through their darkest days. Malik, who had been trying to bury his pain in basketball, was starting to realize that the game wasn't just about running from his grief. It was about moving towards something bigger. And Tyrone, sweet, artistic Tyrone, had found his voice, using his art not only as a form of self-expression, but also as a way to connect with others. It wasn't an easy road. There were still moments of silence at the dinner table, days when memories of Mark would come rushing back, drowning them in waves of grief. But as time passed, the grief became less of a shadow that followed them and more of a quiet presence, something they could acknowledge without being consumed by it. One Thursday afternoon, John found himself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when Derek walked in, a slight unease in his steps. The young man had always been the responsible one, and it was rare for him to seem uncertain. "Hey, John," Derek began, his voice low, like he was preparing for something important. "Can we talk for a minute?" John turned, wiping his hands on a dish towel, sensing the weight behind Derek's words. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Derek hesitated, then sat down at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together tightly. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About what I want to do with my life. About where I go from here. I don't want to just drift through life. I want to make something of myself. Make something of the opportunity Mark gave me. You know." John's heart swelled with pride. Derek had always been driven, but hearing him express such clarity in his intentions made John feel like the years of sacrifice were starting to come full circle. "I think that's a great idea," John said, his voice steady but filled with pride. "What are you thinking?" "I've been looking into college," Derek continued. "I want to study criminal justice. I think I could become a police officer, like a detective or something. I know it's not what Mark would have wanted, but it feels right to me. I want to give back to the community that helped us when we needed it most." John nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He had always admired Derek's compassion, his drive to do something meaningful, and the idea of him pursuing a career in law enforcement, working to protect others the way firefighters protected lives, felt like a perfect fit. It was as though the cycle of service, of sacrifice, was continuing. "I'm proud of you, Derek," John said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing it the right way." And whatever you need, I'll be right here to help you make it happen." Tears welled up in Derek's eyes as he looked at John, his expression vulnerable yet determined. "Thanks, John. I don't know what I would have done without you." John smiled, his heart heavy with both love and loss. "You'd have found your way, but I'm glad it's with me." It was a moment of clarity for both of them. Derek was no longer a boy who needed saving. He was a young man stepping into the world with a purpose. The future, which had once seemed so uncertain, was now filled with possibility. The following week, John helped Derek fill out college applications, reaching out to financial aid offices and tracking down scholarship opportunities. John had always been resourceful, and though money was tight, he would move heaven and earth to ensure Derek had the opportunity to follow his dreams. It was an exciting time for the family. Derek's future was beginning to take shape. But as the summer wore on, it became clear that Malik was struggling in ways that were harder to pinpoint. While Derek was preparing for the future, Malik seemed stuck in the present, caught in a quiet spiral of confusion and anger. His grades were slipping, and despite his natural talent on the basketball court, he seemed to have lost his spark. He'd spend hours at the gym, but wouldn't talk about what was bothering him. John knew Malik was hiding something, but no matter how much he tried to engage, Malik would retreat. One afternoon, after Malik had returned from practice, John sat down with him on the porch. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard, and the cool breeze felt like the beginning of a change. "Hey, Malik, you've been quiet lately," John began gently, hoping to open the door without forcing it. "You okay?" Malik looked at him, his eyes guarded. "I'm fine, John. Just tired." John could tell there was more beneath the surface. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything. I'm not trying to push you, but you're not alone in this." Malik shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, John. I'm just not sure about anything anymore. I don't think I'm cut out for basketball. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I feel like I'm failing everyone." John's heart broke for the young man sitting before him. Malik was struggling with the same feelings of loss, confusion, and fear that so many young people went through in the wake of trauma. The pressure to be strong, to live up to expectations, was overwhelming. "You're not failing anyone, Malik," John said, his voice soft but firm. "You're figuring it out. That's all anyone can ask for. It's okay to not have everything figured out right now. You don't have to have all the answers." Malik's eyes welled with tears, and for the first time in weeks, he let his guard down. "I just miss him, John. I miss how he used to watch me play. I miss how he used to talk about my future. It's like I don't even know who I am without him." John reached out, pulling Malik into a hug. "I miss him too, Malik. Every day. But you're still here. You're still here with us. And that means the world to me. To all of us." Malik sniffled, pulling away slightly to look John in the eye. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I'm not enough to make you proud?" "You already do," John replied. "You don't have to be perfect, son. Just be you. That's all I ever wanted." Malik nodded, his body relaxing for the first time in months. "Thanks, John. I'm sorry for being so distant." "There's nothing to apologize for," John said gently. "We're all just trying to find our way, Malik. One step at a time." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Malik went to his room and, for the first time in a while, started working on a new basketball strategy. He didn't know if he would continue playing professionally or even if basketball was his true passion, but he knew that the journey forward wasn't about getting it all right. It was about taking the next step. And with the support of his family, he felt like he could finally start to believe that whatever came next, he would be able to handle it. Meanwhile, Tyrone had continued to pour his heart into his art. His pieces were more vibrant, more colorful, as he began to incorporate his own experiences into his work. He started submitting his art to local galleries, his drawings finding a new voice in the public eye. There was a quiet beauty in his creations, a healing process that only art could provide. As summer turned to fall, the household became more than just a home. It became a testament to resilience. Every room held pieces of their journey. Derek's college application on the refrigerator, Malik's basketball trophies stacked in a corner, and Tyrone's art hanging proudly on the walls. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, growing, and shaping their futures. John looked around the house, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had lost so much, but in the process, they had gained something even more valuable: each other. The family they had become was forged in the fires of grief, tempered by love, and strengthened by the unshakable bond they shared. And for the first time since the fire, John felt at peace. A dream realized. It was the fall of their third year together, and the promise of new beginnings was clearer than ever. The months of rebuilding, healing, and finding their paths had brought John, Derek, Malik, and Tyrone closer than they had ever imagined possible. The days of grief, while not forgotten, had faded into a distant memory, their sharpness dulled by time, and the strength they had found in each other. The boys had become men in their own right, and John, though still bearing the scars of loss, had become more than a guardian to them. He had become a father in every sense of the word. The house, once a quiet shell of shattered memories, had transformed into a vibrant home, filled with noise and energy. The walls no longer felt empty. Derek was now studying criminal justice at a nearby college, his passion for making a difference guiding him toward a future he never dared to dream of. Malik, once lost in the shadow of his grief, had finally found peace within himself. Basketball was still a part of his life, but now it was a passion, not an escape. He'd joined a local team, and his natural talent was beginning to catch the eye of coaches and recruiters. And Tyrone, whose art had been his refuge, was now a celebrated young artist. His sketches and paintings were being showcased in local galleries, and he was starting to receive invitations to larger, more prestigious exhibits. But it wasn't just the boys' individual successes that made John proud. It was the way they had come to rely on each other, the way they had supported one another through thick and thin. In many ways, they had become a family more bound by choice than by blood. And John couldn't help but marvel at the resilience that each of them had shown in the face of unimaginable tragedy. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon in late October when the shift in their lives came. The fire station, which had long been John's second home, was buzzing with activity. It was a routine day, the usual calls and reports coming in, nothing particularly urgent. John was in the midst of a meeting with his fellow firefighters when his phone buzzed in his pocket. At first, he ignored it, focused on the task at hand, but something about the constant vibration tugged at his attention. Stepping outside for a moment of peace, he took the phone from his pocket and saw the name flashing across the screen. Derek Carter. John's heart skipped a beat. Derek didn't call during the middle of the day unless it was important. With a quick swipe, John answered the call. "Hey, son," John said, a sense of calm masking the sudden flutter of nerves in his chest. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, it's fine," Derek replied, though his voice was tinged with excitement. "But I need you to come home now. There's something we need to talk about." John's brow furrowed in concern, but there was a feeling in Derek's voice that made him pause. This wasn't a call about trouble or school problems. There was something else, something significant. "I'll be there in 10, John said, hanging up quickly and making his way to the fire truck. His mind raced as he drove home, thinking of all the possibilities. Was it about college? Was it something with Malik or Tyrone? 1,000 scenarios ran through his mind, but he could never have predicted what would unfold when he walked through the door. When John arrived at the house, the familiar scene greeted him, the boys, standing in the living room, a strange energy between them. Derek stood at the forefront, a broad smile on his face, while Malik and Tyrone lingered behind, their eyes gleaming with something John couldn't quite place. "Hey, John," Derek greeted, his voice full of energy. "Come on in. We've got something for you." John stepped into the house, his heart thumping in his chest. What was going on? Why did they all look so expectant? He followed them into the living room, where an unfamiliar object was placed on the coffee table, a large, ornate box, the kind you would find at a jewelry store, but it didn't seem like it was something they had bought. "What's this?" John asked, trying to sound casual, though a knot was tightening in his stomach. Derek gestured for him to sit down. "Just open it," he said, his smile wide and infectious. John's hand shook slightly as he lifted the lid of the box, revealing a carefully folded document inside. At first, he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. But then, as his eyes focused on the text, his breath caught in his throat. The document was official. A certificate of adoption. But it wasn't just any adoption. The words on the page read, "John Carter, father and legal guardian of Derek, Malik, and Tyrone Carter." He stared at it, the words sinking in slowly, like a truth he couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. He looked up, confusion still written across his face. "What is this? What does this mean?" Malik stepped forward then, his usual bravado softened by the sincerity in his voice. "It means, John, that we want you to be our dad. Legally. We've talked about it a lot. And we know you've been there for us, through everything. And, well, we just want to make it official." John's eyes widened, his heart slamming against his chest. He didn't know what to say. For so long, he had felt like an outsider in their lives, trying to fill the shoes of a father who had never truly been replaced. But this was more than he could have ever hoped for. It was a gift beyond measure. A gift that didn't come with conditions or expectations, but pure love and a desire to make him feel like he truly belonged. Derek continued, his voice steady. "We talked to a lawyer, and we filed the paperwork a few weeks ago. It wasn't an easy decision, but we realize that you've already given us everything. You've given us a home, a future, and a family. And now, we want to give you something in return. We want you to be our dad. For real." John's eyes filled with tears. He had raised these boys, nurtured them through their darkest moments, watched them grow into men of character and strength. But to hear them say this, to offer him this piece of their hearts, it was everything. He had always been their father in spirit, but now they were giving him the legal right to be their dad, in every sense of the word. I don't even know what to say," John murmured, wiping his eyes. "You've already given me more than I could ever have imagined." "You don't have to say anything, John," Malik said, his voice full of emotion. "We just want you to know that we're yours. Always." Tyrone, standing by the door with a faint smile, added, "You've been our dad since day one. This just makes it official." And in that moment, John felt an overwhelming surge of love and pride. The pain of the past, the struggle, the losses, all of it seemed to fade away, replaced by the warmth of this new chapter in their lives. They weren't just a family because of the fire, or because of the tragedy they had overcome. They were a family because of the love they had cultivated, the bond they had nurtured, and the future they had built together. As John pulled them all into a tight embrace, he whispered words he had never spoken before but felt deep within his soul. "I love you, all of you, and I'm so proud of the men you've become." The tears flowed freely then, not out of sadness, but because of the beauty of it all. A family, reborn from the ashes of loss, built on love, and solidified by choice. It wasn't the life any of them had expected, but it was the life they had created together. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest gift of all. The boys were no longer boys. They had become his sons, his forever sons. And John was no longer just their guardian. He was their father, in every way that mattered. And as he sat there, surrounded by the people he loved most, John Carter knew that their journey was only just beginning. The road ahead was full of unknowns, but they would face it together, as a family, forever. A legacy of love. The weeks following the official adoption were filled with a quiet joy, a sense of peace settling over the household like a warm blanket. It was as if the weight that had always hung between John and the boys had been lifted, replaced by a deeper, more profound connection. No longer were they bound by the past, by grief or circumstance. They were now linked by something even stronger, their love for each other. The legal document that made John their father was just a formality, a recognition of what had already been true for years. It was an acknowledgement of the family they had built through sacrifice, effort, and unconditional love. John knew that this new chapter was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, and challenges would continue to arise. But as he looked around the house, now filled with reminders of each of his son's dreams, achievements, and passions, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This wasn't just a family in name. It was a family forged in the truest sense of the word. In the months that followed the adoption, the boys continued to grow into their futures. Derek was excelling in his criminal justice studies, his passion for serving others evident in his every word. His grades were high, and he had started working as an intern with the local police department, shadowing officers and learning about the intricacies of law enforcement. Derek often stayed late at the station to ask questions, and though he was still learning the ropes, it was clear that this was his calling. He had always been determined, but now there was a fire in him, an urgency to give back to the community that had helped him so much. Malik, who had once been consumed with doubts, was thriving on the court. His game had improved drastically, and his confidence had returned with a newfound sense of purpose. The recruiters had taken notice, and soon he was offered a scholarship to play at a nearby university. But it wasn't just the game that had captured his attention. Malik had also begun volunteering as a coach for younger kids at a local youth program, teaching them basketball, but also imparting the lessons he had learned, how to persevere, how to never give up, and how to use sports as a way to better themselves, both on and off the court. Tyrone, the quiet artist, had become a local sensation in the art community. His work had found a home in various galleries, and his pieces were beginning to fetch attention from buyers all over the country. What started as a way for him to cope with the pain of his past had blossomed into something more, something he never could have predicted. His artwork was no longer just a release, but a way for him to connect with others, to show them the beauty in the struggle, the light that could come even from the darkest of places. He had recently been invited to display his work at a national art exhibition in New York, and though he was hesitant at first, John knew his son was ready. He had come so far from the shy boy who had struggled to find his voice. Through it all, John had remained their steadfast support, attending their games, cheering them on at art exhibits, and sitting in on Derek's classes when he asked for help. He was proud of them, but it wasn't just about their achievements. What mattered most to him was how they had grown as individuals, how they had faced their fears, their doubts, and their grief, and how they had come out stronger, more resilient, and more compassionate. But despite the progress, despite the beautiful future they were building, the past was never far from their minds. The void left by Mark's death could never be fully filled, and the scars of that loss lingered, though they had learned how to live with it. Every now and then, one of the boys would catch John's eye across the room, and without saying a word, they would both understand the unspoken ache, the longing for the father they had lost. They didn't dwell on it, but it was there, a quiet presence, a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had overcome. One crisp winter evening, as the holiday season approached, John found himself standing in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The scent of simmering stew filled the air, and the hum of Christmas music played softly in the background. The house was warm, filled with the comfort of routine of family. John had come to cherish these moments of normalcy, the way the boys would pile into the living room, arguing over who had the best Christmas tree decorations, the way they would wrap presents for each other, always with a bit of humor and a lot of love. But tonight felt different. Tonight, there was something more, something in the air that he couldn't quite place. As he chopped vegetables, he heard the sound of car doors closing outside. Then the front door opened, and the familiar shuffle of footsteps echoed in the hallway. It was the boys, but there was someone else with them. Someone John hadn't expected. When he turned around, his heart skipped a beat. Standing at the door was an older man, a tall figure with a warm, familiar smile. It took John a moment to process the sight, but when he did, the realization hit him like a wave. It was Mark. Not the Mark they had lost, not the man who had passed away in the fire, but a version of him that none of them had ever expected. Mark's brother, Jason Thompson, stood in the doorway, carrying the suitcase. His expression was soft, almost apologetic as he looked at John, his eyes filled with emotion. "I'm sorry," Jason said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know how to come back before, but I'm here now, and I want to make things right." John stood frozen for a moment, his mind reeling. The years of pain, of anger, of unanswered questions flooded back. Jason had been absent from their lives after Mark's death, and for a long time, John had blamed him for not stepping in when his brother's family needed him most. But now, seeing him standing there, humble, remorseful, and with an undeniable sincerity, John felt a shift in his heart. This wasn't the time for bitterness or resentment. This was the moment for healing. "You're here," John said, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "After all these years, you're here." "I know," Jason replied, his eyes filled with tears. "And I know it doesn't change the past. But I want to be here for you, be here for the boys. I should have been here before. I can't undo what happened, but I can be here now. I owe it to Mark, and I owe it to you." John's heart softened. He had spent so many years angry at Jason for disappearing when the family needed him most. But in that moment, he realized something important. People make mistakes. They fail. They falter. But in the end, it's not about the past. It's about the willingness to show up when it matters the most. Jason had finally shown up, and that was enough for John. Derek, Malik, and Tyrone stood in the doorway behind Jason, their expressions unreadable. They had all grown up with the absence of their uncle, but they hadn't known the full story. Now they stood in the room, unsure of what to make of this moment. It wasn't just the return of an estranged relative. It was the return of a piece of their past that had always been shrouded in mystery. "Boys," John said, his voice steady but filled with warmth, "this is your Uncle Jason. I know we've all had our distance, but he's here now. And it's time for us to make room for him, to heal, and to move forward as a family." Jason stepped forward, his eyes meeting each of the boys in turn. "I'm sorry for not being there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't change the past, but I can be here for you now. I want to help however I can." The room was silent for a long moment as the weight of the moment settled in. But then, slowly, one by one, Derek, Malik, and Tyrone stepped forward. Derek, always the first to act, extended his hand to Jason, his face softening with understanding. "It's good to have you here, Uncle Jason," he said quietly, his voice tinged with respect. Malik followed suit, clapping Jason on the shoulder. "It's been a long time, man, but I'm glad you came." Tyrone, the most reserved of the three, stepped forward last, his eyes searching Jason's face before he gave him a small nod. "I guess we can start over. We'll see how it goes." Jason's eyes glistened with tears as he looked around the room at the family that had welcomed him back. They didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, they had found something incredibly valuable. The power of second chances, the strength of forgiveness, and the hope of a future built on the foundation of love. And so the Carter family stood together, not just as a group of individuals, but as a unit, united by loss, but also by the promise of new beginnings. Together, they would carry the legacy of love and sacrifice that had been passed down to them, ready to face whatever the future held. Full circle. It had been 3 months since Jason had re-entered their lives, and in that short time, the transformation within the Carter family was nothing short of miraculous. It hadn't been easy, of course. There were awkward silences, unspoken questions, and moments of hesitation that reminded everyone of the years that had passed in silence. But despite the initial discomfort, the bond between Jason and the boys began to form slowly but surely. John had never expected this. When Jason first appeared on their doorstep, he had been cautious. Part of him wanted to turn his back on the man who had, in his eyes, abandoned his brother's family at their time of greatest need. But now, seeing the effort Jason was making, seeing his desire to make amends, John had come to understand that people's journeys were not always linear, and sometimes healing could only begin when someone was ready to face their mistakes, no matter how long it took. And Jason was ready now. The boys, too, had taken their time warming to their uncle. Derek had been the most open-minded, always willing to extend the benefit of the doubt to those who wanted to change. He was the first to welcome Jason back with a handshake, then a hug. Malik, the natural skeptic, had been more guarded but respected Jason's sincerity. It took him longer to let go of his resentment, but his love for the family was stronger than his past frustrations. Tyrone, quiet and thoughtful, had been the hardest to read. He'd stood back, assessing Jason from a distance, uncertain if he could let someone into his emotional circle after so many years of feeling abandoned. But with time, and with Jason proving himself through small acts of kindness, the walls began to come down. Jason would show up for dinner, help with yard work, and attend the boys' games and exhibitions. Slowly, he became part of the rhythm of their lives. He'd even started taking an active role in their lives, helping Derek with his criminal justice studies, offering advice to Malik about his basketball career, and providing feedback on Tyrone's artwork. It wasn't always perfect. There were still moments of discomfort, of old wounds resurfacing. But it was enough. It was a beginning. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal. The days grew longer, the weather warmer, and the Carter family had finally settled into a new chapter. It wasn't just about healing the rift between them and Jason. It was about moving forward, accepting the love and care they had for each other, and embracing the future with open hearts. One crisp Saturday morning, John stood in the kitchen, brewing coffee as he glanced over his notes for a firefighter training session he would be leading that afternoon. The house was quieter than usual, the boys out doing their own things. Derek was meeting with a local law enforcement officer about an internship opportunity. Malik was at the gym preparing for an upcoming tournament, and Tyrone had a new commission for a mural in the city. John had come to appreciate the rare moments of solitude, though it was often fleeting. But that morning, the quiet was broken by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Looking out the window, John saw Jason's familiar truck. The man had been coming by more often these days, especially since he'd begun working part-time at a local construction company. Jason had taken on the responsibility of not only making amends with the boys, but also contributing to the family in a practical way. He wasn't just trying to earn forgiveness. He was showing up in the real world, proving his commitment through action. John smiled to himself, feeling an unexpected warmth. It was a strange thing, this full circle moment. A man who had once felt like a ghost in his own life, so consumed by his own guilt and shame, was now actively helping to raise the children of his brother. The same children he had once abandoned. Life had a way of surprising people, of giving them opportunities for redemption that they never thought possible. Jason had taken his second chance, and for that, John was grateful. As the door opened, Jason stepped inside, wiping his boots on the mat. "Morning, John," he said, his voice steady but laced with warmth. He gave John a quick nod, walking toward the kitchen where he knew the coffee was brewing. "Busy day ahead." "Always," John replied, chuckling. "But it's good. How's the crew?" Jason poured himself a cup of coffee, settling into the chair at the kitchen table. "Same as always. Hard work, but good work. I'm grateful for it. It's been a long road, but I'm getting there." John sat across from him, taking a sip of his own coffee. "Yeah, we all are." For a moment, the two men sat in silence, simply enjoying the peacefulness of the morning. It wasn't often that they had these moments where words weren't needed and everything was just comfortable. The quiet was a welcome contrast to the noise of their lives. The firehouse, the boys' schedules, the new dynamics with Jason. It had all been so overwhelming at times. But right now, it felt like everything was exactly where it needed to be. "What's next for you, Jason?" John asked, his voice soft but genuine. "I know you've been helping out around here, but what's the plan long term?" Jason looked out the window for a moment, considering the question. He'd never been one to have a solid plan, always taking things day by day, trying to survive the best way he could. But now, with the boys in his life again, and a renewed sense of purpose, he was beginning to think further ahead. "I'm not sure," Jason admitted, his voice thoughtful. "But I know I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. I've got a lot to make up for, and I want to do it right this time. I've been thinking about starting my own construction business, something small, but enough to provide for my family. I've learned that you don't need to have everything figured out. You just need to keep showing up, one day at a time." John nodded, impressed by Jason's resolve. "That sounds like a good plan. You've come a long way, Jason." Jason met his eyes and smiled, the years of hurt between them beginning to truly fade. "It's been a long road, but I'm here now, and that's all I can offer." John's heart swelled with gratitude. There was something incredibly humbling about seeing a man take responsibility for his past mistakes and do the hard work of healing. Jason was doing just that. The shame, the regret, he wasn't letting it define him anymore. He was building a new future, not just for himself, but for the family that had taken him back, despite everything. And in doing so, he was teaching them all an invaluable lesson. It's never too late to make things right. Later that afternoon, as John wrapped up his fire safety training session, he received a call from Derek. "Hey, Dad," Derek said, his voice excited. "You won't believe what just happened. I got the internship at the police department. I'm starting next week." John's heart leaped in his chest. "That's incredible, son. I'm so proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad," Derek replied, his voice filled with emotion. "You've always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. You've always been there for me, and I want to make you proud." John smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. "You already have, Derek. You already have." That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the atmosphere was one of celebration. It wasn't a special occasion, not really, but they had learned to celebrate the small victories, each moment of progress. Whether it was Derek's internship, Malik's basketball scholarship, or Tyrone's growing success as an artist, was a victory for them all. They had come so far. The past was still there, but it no longer defined them. They were writing a new story, one where love and family took center stage. Jason sat at the table, looking around at the three boys, his nephews, and John, the man who had taken him in when he had nothing to offer. He had a quiet smile on his face, a glimmer of peace in his eyes. John caught his gaze, his own smile forming. "You're a part of this now, Jason. Don't ever forget that." Jason nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deeply into his heart. "I won't. I won't." As the night wore on, and the family enjoyed their meal together, John felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They had come through the storm. They had found each other again. And in doing so, they had built something beautiful, a legacy of love, resilience, and the power of second chances. The future, though uncertain, now seemed filled with endless possibilities. And no matter what came next, John knew this. They would face it together, forever.